The moment my husband laughed into the microphone and said, "She's lucky I kept her," I realized something strange. The only person in the entire ballroom who wasn't laughing was the billionaire standing near the stage. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything in my life quietly began to change. The ballroom at the Whitmore Foundation Gala glittered like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, scattering warm light across polished marble floors. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne flutes, and somewhere behind the velvet curtains a string quartet played softly enough that conversations floated easily across the room. It was one of those Manhattan charity events where everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged, except, apparently, me. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 67 years old, and until that evening, I had been married to Richard Hayes for 43 years. If you had asked anyone in that room, they would have said we were a success story. Richard built one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the Northeast, a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His photo had appeared in business magazines. He spoke at conferences. People shook his hand like they were meeting someone important. And for decades, whenever reporters asked how he did it, he would smile and say, "Hard work and a supportive wife." That supportive wife was me. I had spent the afternoon getting ready in the quiet apartment we owned on the Upper East Side. I chose a navy blue evening dress I'd worn only once before. It was simple, elegant, the kind of dress that doesn't demand attention but never feels out of place. I brushed my silver hair carefully and fastened the small pearl earrings my mother gave me when I turned 30. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the same woman who had stood beside Richard at every milestone, opening the first office, signing the first contract, celebrating the first profitable year. I wasn't flashy. I never tried to be. But I had always believed I belonged beside him. By the time we arrived at the gala, the ballroom was already half full. Business leaders, investors, nonprofit directors, and politicians mingled around the stage where Richard would soon give his speech. The Whitmore Foundation had invited him as one of the evening's featured donors. My husband loved nights like this. He loved being introduced. Loved hearing applause. Loved the warm glow of admiration that surrounded success. I stood beside him as people approached our table. "Richard, congratulations on the expansion," one man said, shaking his hand enthusiastically. "Incredible work," another added. A few glanced at me politely. "And you must be Eleanor," someone said with a quick smile before turning back to my husband. I had grown used to that. Over the years I had learned something about success. When people admire the man at the podium, they rarely ask about the woman sitting quietly beside it. The speeches began shortly after dinner was served. One by one, speakers thanked donors and sponsors. Then Richard's name was announced. The applause came immediately, loud and confident. My husband straightened his tuxedo jacket and walked toward the stage like he owned the room. For a moment, watching him climb those steps, I felt something familiar, a quiet pride I had carried for decades. The man on that stage had once been a young dreamer with a borrowed desk and a business plan scribbled on yellow legal paper. I remembered the nights we stayed up calculating payroll. I remembered selling my old car to cover expenses when the company nearly folded in its third year. But the room didn't know those stories. To them, Richard Hayes had always been successful. He adjusted the microphone and began his speech. It started the way these speeches always do, with gratitude and humor. He thanked investors, praised the foundation, told a light-hearted story about his first delivery truck breaking down in New Jersey 25 years earlier. The audience laughed politely. Then his tone shifted slightly. "And of course," he said, gesturing toward our table, "none of this would have been possible without my wife." A few heads turned in my direction. I smiled automatically. It was a line I had heard many times. But then Richard chuckled and added something I had never heard before. "Though if I'm being honest," he said, shaking his head with a grin, "she's lucky I kept her all these years." For half a second the room seemed uncertain how to react. Then someone laughed. Another joined. Within seconds the entire ballroom rippled with amused applause. People assumed it was a joke. Maybe it was meant to be. I kept smiling, because that's what you do in rooms like this. You smile. You nod. You pretend the comment floated harmlessly through the air like confetti. But something inside me went strangely quiet. I could feel the laughter moving through the room like a wave, but I wasn't part of it. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. I simply sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching the man I had stood beside for 43 years turn my life into a punchline. And that was when I noticed something unusual. Near the stage, standing slightly apart from the crowd, was Charles Whitmore. At 72, Charles was one of the wealthiest men in the country and the founder of the very foundation hosting the gala. He was known for being calm, deliberate, and rarely surprised by anything. Yet while everyone else laughed at Richard's joke, Charles Whitmore wasn't smiling. He was watching. Watching my husband. Watching the audience. And then, slowly, he looked toward me. Our eyes met for only a moment. In that brief glance, I saw something unexpected in his expression, not amusement, not confusion, but recognition. As if he understood something about that moment that no one else in the room had noticed yet. Richard finished his speech to enthusiastic applause and stepped away from the podium. But before the next presenter could approach the stage, Charles Whitmore did something no one anticipated. He walked forward, reached for the microphone, and said quietly, "Before we continue tonight, there's something I'd like to clarify." The room fell silent. And in that silence, I realized the night was far from over. The room remained silent after Charles Whitmore took the microphone, the kind of silence that does not happen often in a ballroom filled with wealthy donors and polished executives. I could hear the faint clinking of glassware somewhere near the back tables and the soft hum of the air conditioning system high above the chandeliers. No one expected Charles Whitmore to interrupt the program. He was known for being deliberate, careful with his words, and rarely spontaneous in public settings. That was precisely why every person in the room suddenly paid attention. Richard had just stepped down from the podium and was still smiling as if the evening were unfolding exactly the way he planned. His hands rested comfortably in the pockets of his tuxedo, and he looked around the ballroom with the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. When he noticed Charles approaching the microphone, his smile faltered for only a fraction of a second before returning again. Richard assumed this was simply a gesture of support, perhaps a brief congratulation from the host of the event. Most people in the audience seemed to think the same thing. I remained seated at our table, my hands folded neatly on the white linen tablecloth. The applause from Richard's speech had faded, but the echo of laughter still lingered in my mind. "She is lucky I kept her." The words had floated through the room so easily, as though they were harmless. Yet hearing them out loud in front of hundreds of people felt strangely different from hearing them in private. Over the years Richard had occasionally made remarks like that during dinners or quiet conversations with friends. He liked to present himself as the clever one in the marriage, the man who had generously tolerated a quiet wife who did not understand business. Most people assumed it was humor. I used to believe that as well. But sitting there beneath the golden chandeliers, something inside me felt clearer than it had in a long time. Charles Whitmore adjusted the microphone slightly, lowering it a few inches. He was a tall man with silver hair and the calm posture of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that moved markets and changed industries. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the ballroom without needing to be raised. "Richard," he said, turning slightly toward my husband. "I hope you will not mind if I take a moment before we continue the program." Richard laughed politely and lifted one hand as if to say of course. "Not at all, Charles," he replied from the side of the stage. "Please." The audience shifted in their seats, curious now. Charity galas follow careful schedules. Interruptions are rare. But Charles Whitmore did not seem concerned about the schedule. He looked out across the ballroom slowly, scanning the faces in the crowd, and then his gaze returned to our table. For a moment I wondered if I should stand, but I remained seated. Something told me it was better to stay exactly where I was. "Many of you in this room," Charles began, "know Richard Hayes as a remarkable businessman." There were murmurs of agreement from several tables. A few people nodded. Richard's company had expanded rapidly in recent years, acquiring smaller logistics firms and securing contracts with major retailers across the East Coast. In business magazines he was often described as bold and visionary. Charles paused briefly before continuing. But success stories, he said calmly, rarely belong to one person. The words were simple, but the tone in which he spoke them felt deliberate. I noticed several heads turning toward me now, perhaps remembering that Richard had mentioned his wife during the speech. Richard himself seemed slightly puzzled, though he still maintained the relaxed smile that had served him well for decades. Charles rested one hand lightly against the podium. I remember a very different version of the Hayes Company, he continued. A much smaller version. 25 years ago. I felt my breath slow as the memory surfaced immediately. 25 years earlier Richard and I were not attending charity galas in Manhattan. We were working late nights in a rented office above a hardware store in Queens. The company had exactly 3 employees and one aging delivery truck that broke down more often than it ran. I remembered sitting at a narrow desk surrounded by stacks of invoices while Richard called potential clients who rarely returned his calls. I remembered calculating payroll by hand because we could not yet afford an accountant. Those memories lived quietly inside me, but I had not expected to hear them mentioned in a ballroom filled with investors and executives. Charles continued speaking. At that time, he said, I was introduced to the company by someone I trusted. Someone who believed the business had potential, but more importantly believed the people behind it had integrity. He paused again. The audience listened carefully now. Richard's smile had faded slightly, replaced by the polite attentiveness of a man trying to understand where the story was going. Charles turned his head just enough to look directly at Richard. You may not remember this, he said, but the first meeting we ever had about your company did not happen in a conference room. Richard blinked once, clearly unsure how to respond. Charles smiled faintly, though the smile carried more reflection than humor. It happened in a small diner in Queens, he continued. The kind that serves coffee in thick white mugs and keeps the lights on all night for truck drivers. Several people in the audience chuckled softly at the image. But I felt something different. I remembered that diner very well. The vinyl booths. The smell of fresh coffee. The nervous excitement Richard felt before that meeting. Charles looked out across the room again. And during that meeting, he said slowly, the person who convinced me the company was worth believing in was not Richard. The quiet in the ballroom deepened. I felt the weight of several curious glances from nearby tables. Charles lifted one hand and gestured gently toward where I sat. It was Eleanor. For a moment no one reacted. The name seemed to hang in the air like a question people were still processing. I remained still in my chair, my heart beating steadily but without panic. Charles's voice remained calm and measured. She explained how the company actually worked, he said. How the routes were scheduled. How the drivers were paid. How every dollar was tracked so the business could survive another month. He looked directly at Richard again. That kind of clarity impressed me. Richard shifted slightly on his feet now, clearly uncomfortable. He had not expected this direction. But Charles was not finished. He leaned closer to the microphone and spoke in the same calm tone that had already captured the entire room. So when I heard the comment just now that Eleanor is lucky you kept her, he said, I felt it might be appropriate to remind everyone of something. The audience leaned forward slightly. Even the waiters had paused their quiet movements near the walls. Charles Whitmore's next sentence would determine the mood of the entire evening, and somehow I knew that whatever he said next would also determine the future of my marriage. Charles Whitmore let the silence linger for several seconds after his last sentence, and the effect was immediate. In a ballroom filled with experienced investors, executives, and donors, people understood when something important was about to be said. The soft music behind the curtains had already stopped, and the entire room felt suspended in a quiet moment of attention. I remained seated at our table, my hands still resting lightly on the tablecloth, watching the man at the podium with a calm I did not fully understand yet. Across the stage, Richard's posture had changed slightly. His shoulders were still straight, but the relaxed confidence he carried earlier had begun to fade. He was listening. Carefully now. Charles leaned forward a little and spoke again, his voice steady and clear. The reason I invested in the Hayes Company all those years ago was not because I heard a brilliant speech, he said. It was because I met someone who understood the business better than anyone else in that diner. A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. People glanced from the stage toward me and then back again. Charles gestured gently in my direction once more. Eleanor explained the numbers, the drivers, the routes, and the contracts. She knew exactly how every shipment moved from warehouse to store. That kind of knowledge does not come from watching from the sidelines. It comes from building something piece by piece. I could feel dozens of eyes on me now, but I did not move. For years I had grown accustomed to sitting quietly in rooms where business conversations happened around me as if I were part of the furniture. Tonight was different, but I still felt no need to interrupt the moment. Charles continued calmly. When people talk about success, he said, they often imagine one person standing alone at the top. But the truth is usually far more complicated. Companies are built by teams. By partnerships. By people who work long hours long before anyone notices. Richard cleared his throat softly near the side of the stage. It was a small sound, but in the quiet room it carried easily. He forced a polite smile again and spoke toward Charles. Of course Eleanor helped, he said lightly. We were partners in the early days. Charles turned his head slightly toward him. Yes, he replied. You were. The pause that followed was subtle but unmistakable. Charles looked back at the audience before continuing. However, he said, there is another detail about that first investment that most people in this room probably do not know. Now the curiosity in the ballroom deepened. Several people leaned forward in their chairs. Richard's expression had shifted again. He was no longer smiling. I remembered that first investment very clearly. 25 years earlier we had been desperate for someone willing to believe in a small logistics company operating out of a rented office with peeling paint on the walls. Banks had rejected our loan applications more than once. Suppliers demanded payment terms we could barely manage. That meeting with Charles Whitmore had felt like our last real chance. I remembered sitting across from him in that diner booth while Richard spoke enthusiastically about expansion plans. I remembered Charles asking careful questions about how the company actually functioned day to day. And I remembered answering those questions honestly because someone needed to explain the reality behind the numbers. Charles rested both hands lightly on the sides of the podium now. At the time of that investment, he said, I insisted on a simple condition. The audience waited quietly. Richard's brow tightened slightly as if he were trying to remember something he had not thought about in years. Charles continued. I believed the company had promise, but I also believed that the person who understood its operations should always have a voice in how it was run. That is why the original agreement included a structural safeguard. I could hear faint murmurs moving through the crowd now. Investors understood language like that very well. Structural safeguard was not the kind of phrase used casually in business agreements. Richard shifted his weight on the stage again. Charles, he said carefully, I am not sure this is really necessary tonight. Charles smiled politely but did not step away from the microphone. Perhaps not, he replied calmly. But I believe clarity is always helpful. He looked back toward the audience once more. The investment agreement required that a portion of the company's controlling trust be linked permanently to the person who demonstrated the strongest operational understanding during that first meeting. The murmurs grew louder now. Some people exchanged glances. Others began quietly calculating what that might mean. Richard's face had grown noticeably still. Charles finished the thought in the same measured tone. That person was Eleanor Hayes. The words settled over the room slowly, like a realization unfolding in real time. I felt the shift immediately. The same people who had laughed a few minutes earlier were now studying the situation with careful interest. In the world of business, control matters more than applause. And suddenly the story they thought they understood about Richard Hayes looked very different. Charles adjusted the microphone once more before speaking again. Which means, he said gently, that the success of this company has always depended on more than one person standing on that stage. For the first time since the speech began, I saw genuine uncertainty in Richard's expression. And in that quiet moment beneath the chandeliers, I realized something else as well. The evening that had begun with a joke about how lucky I was had quietly become a conversation about who had actually built the foundation beneath everything my husband claimed to own. I did not stand up after Charles Whitmore finished speaking. I did not rush to the stage or try to explain anything. I simply remained in my chair, watching the room slowly absorb the meaning of what he had just revealed. Moments earlier the ballroom had been filled with laughter at my husband's joke. Now the atmosphere felt entirely different. Conversations did not resume. Glasses were still held midair. Even the people who had been whispering to each other only seconds before now seemed uncertain whether speaking would break something fragile in the room. Charles Whitmore stepped slightly away from the microphone but did not leave the stage. His presence alone kept the focus exactly where he intended it. Richard, meanwhile, stood only a few feet from him, his expression carefully controlled but noticeably tense. My husband had spent decades mastering public appearances. He knew how to smile when reporters asked difficult questions. He knew how to redirect conversations in boardrooms. But tonight something had happened that he had not prepared for. The story of his success had always been simple. Richard Hayes was the visionary founder who built a logistics empire from nothing. It was a narrative that investors liked and journalists repeated. But Charles Whitmore had just introduced another version of that story. A version that included details the audience had never heard before. I noticed several executives at the nearby tables quietly exchanging glances. Some of them had done business with Richard for years. Others had invested in his company during later expansion rounds. They were now reconsidering the structure behind the company they believed they understood. Because anyone familiar with corporate governance knew that the phrase controlling trust carried enormous weight. Control in business does not always belong to the loudest voice or the person standing at the podium. It belongs to whoever holds the legal authority behind the organization. Richard stepped forward again, clearly attempting to recover the tone of the evening. He gave a polite laugh and reached for the microphone. "Well," he said lightly, "Charles always enjoys telling old stories." A few people forced small smiles, but the reaction was cautious now. Richard continued speaking, trying to regain the friendly rhythm of a gala speech. "Of course Eleanor helped in the early years. Every entrepreneur's spouse does." The statement hung in the air, sounding more defensive than reassuring. I noticed Charles Whitmore watching him carefully, his expression unchanged. My husband turned toward the audience again, gesturing casually with one hand. "But businesses grow and evolve," he added. "The company we have today is the result of many years of leadership and strategic decisions." He emphasized the word leadership slightly. It was a subtle attempt to redirect attention back to himself. For a moment it almost worked. Some people nodded politely, eager for the evening to return to its original program. Charity events are designed to feel comfortable. No one expects them to become complicated discussions about corporate structure. But Charles Whitmore stepped forward again before Richard could fully close the moment. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached for the microphone once more. "That is true," Charles said calmly. "Businesses do evolve." The room quieted again immediately. Richard paused mid-sentence and stepped back half a step, clearly irritated but unwilling to challenge Charles directly in front of so many influential guests. Charles continued speaking with the same composed tone. "However, agreements made at the beginning of a company often remain important long after the business becomes successful." He rested one hand lightly against the podium. "Especially when those agreements were designed to protect the stability of the company itself." The investors in the audience understood exactly what that meant. Safeguards written into early investment documents often remain binding decades later. They exist precisely to prevent control from shifting unexpectedly when companies grow larger and more valuable. Richard's jaw tightened slightly now. He looked toward Charles and then briefly toward me. For the first time in many years, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. I remembered that diner meeting clearly. After the coffee cups had been cleared away and the discussion about shipping routes had ended, Charles Whitmore had asked one final question. He had looked directly at me and said, "If this company grows, who will make sure the practical side of the operation stays honest?" At the time I answered without thinking. I simply explained how every delivery, every invoice, and every contract had to be tracked carefully or the business would collapse under its own growth. Charles had listened quietly, then nodded as if confirming something he had already suspected. That conversation had lasted less than 2 hours, but it changed everything that followed. Charles now looked out across the ballroom once more. "Many people here tonight know the Hayes Company as a successful logistics enterprise operating across multiple states," he said. "What fewer people know is that its operational structure was originally built around Eleanor's system for managing distribution routes and financial accountability." I noticed several investors leaning toward each other again, clearly intrigued. Charles was not telling a sentimental story about a supportive spouse. He was describing operational architecture. That kind of detail mattered far more than applause at a charity event. Richard finally spoke again, his voice tighter now. "Charles," he said carefully, "this really is not the place for a corporate history lesson." The comment drew a few nervous laughs from the audience, but the humor felt forced. Charles smiled slightly, though his eyes remained focused. "Perhaps not," he replied. "But it is the place where something else just happened." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. A public statement was made suggesting Eleanor was fortunate to have been kept. The words were delivered without anger, without accusation, simply as a matter of fact. Charles continued, "And when statements like that are made in a room filled with people who understand business, it is only fair that the full context be understood as well." The silence returned again, heavier this time. Richard no longer attempted to interrupt. He stood beside the stage with the uneasy posture of someone realizing the conversation had moved far beyond his control. I remained seated at our table, listening quietly, feeling something shift slowly inside me. For years I had accepted the comfortable version of our story because it seemed easier. Richard was the face of the company. I was the quiet partner who supported him behind the scenes. But tonight the truth was unfolding in front of hundreds of witnesses. And as Charles Whitmore prepared to speak again, I began to understand that the evening was no longer about a careless joke made on stage. It was about revealing a foundation that had been invisible to everyone except the few people who had been there when the company was nothing more than a fragile idea inside a small diner booth in Queens. For a few seconds after Charles Whitmore finished his last sentence, no one in the ballroom moved. It was the kind of silence that only appears when people realize the story they believed a moment ago is no longer the complete story. I sat at our table with my hands folded in front of me, feeling dozens of curious eyes drift in my direction. The chandeliers above reflected softly in the polished marble floor, and the quiet murmur of the city outside the tall windows seemed very far away. Richard stood near the stage, still holding the confident posture he had practiced for years, but something about him had shifted. The relaxed smile he had worn earlier was gone. In its place was the careful expression of someone trying to calculate what the next move should be. For decades Richard had always known exactly how to control a room. Tonight was different. Charles Whitmore remained beside the podium, calm and composed. He did not rush his words. He did not raise his voice. Instead he allowed the audience time to think about what had already been said. The investors seated around the ballroom were not casual listeners. These were people who understood the language of contracts and equity. When they heard phrases like controlling trust and structural safeguard, they did not hear a polite anecdote. They heard legal authority. Finally Charles spoke again. "I believe the evening should continue," he said calmly. "This is, after all, a charity event meant to support important work." A few guests nodded with relief. The tension in the room eased slightly. But Charles had not finished speaking. "However," he continued, "before we move forward, I would like to share one more detail from that original agreement. It will help explain why I felt it necessary to clarify the story tonight." Richard stepped forward again, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. "Charles," he said with a polite but strained laugh, perhaps we can discuss historical details privately tomorrow. His voice carried a hint of urgency that had not been there earlier. Charles turned toward him briefly, his expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. "Richard," he said quietly, "I would agree with you if tonight had remained a celebration of the company. But a statement was made suggesting Eleanor's role in this partnership was a matter of luck. And that is not accurate." A soft murmur moved across the tables again. I noticed several people leaning closer to hear every word. Charles rested one hand on the edge of the podium and continued. "When I invested in the Hayes Company, I was not interested in funding a personality. I was interested in supporting a system that could grow without collapsing under its own weight. Eleanor demonstrated that system." My mind drifted briefly back to those early years again. The long nights balancing invoices. The handwritten schedules taped to the office wall. The quiet discipline required to make a fragile business survive one more month. Those details had never seemed extraordinary to me. They were simply what needed to be done. Charles looked across the audience once more. "That is why the agreement included something unusual," he said. "A clause ensuring that operational authority could not be separated entirely from the person who designed that system." The room became still again. Even people who were not lawyers understood the significance of those words. Authority is the quiet force that shapes decisions long before they appear in public announcements. Richard's expression had grown noticeably tight now. "I think we are giving the audience more legal detail than they expected tonight," he said carefully. The remark drew a few nervous chuckles, but no one looked away from the stage. Charles nodded slightly. "Perhaps," he replied. "But sometimes clarity is more valuable than comfort." He paused for a moment before continuing. "The clause ensured that certain major decisions involving the company would always require Eleanor's approval." This time the reaction in the room was unmistakable. A ripple of surprise passed through several tables. Some guests sat back in their chairs while others leaned forward with new interest. Richard's shoulders stiffened. I could see the realization slowly forming in his mind. For years he had behaved as if the company belonged entirely to him. The public narrative supported that belief. Investors spoke to him. Reporters interviewed him. Even many employees assumed he held the final authority. But the documents written decades earlier told a more complicated story. Charles continued speaking with the same calm tone. "This arrangement was never meant to limit Richard's leadership. It was designed to protect the operational integrity of the company." He turned his gaze toward me again. "Eleanor was the one who built the foundation that allowed the business to scale responsibly." I noticed something remarkable then. The room no longer looked at me with casual curiosity. The expressions I saw now were different. Respect. Recognition. Perhaps even a little embarrassment from those who had laughed earlier. Richard took a slow breath and stepped closer to the microphone again. "Eleanor has always been supportive," he said carefully. "But the day-to-day decisions have been mine for many years." Charles nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. "And many of those decisions helped the company grow. But the structure protecting the company still exists." The words settled into the room like a quiet revelation. No one laughed now. No one whispered. They simply listened. I sat there quietly, feeling the weight of the evening shift in a way I had never expected. For decades I had accepted being invisible in rooms like this because it seemed easier than correcting the narrative. But tonight the truth was unfolding without my effort. Charles Whitmore had not stood up to defend me personally. He had stood up to defend accuracy. And accuracy, in the world of business, has a way of changing everything. As I looked toward the stage, I realized that the comment Richard had made only minutes earlier had triggered something far larger than a moment of embarrassment. It had opened a conversation about who truly understood the company that had shaped our lives. And for the first time in many years, the answer to that question was no longer hidden quietly behind the polite smile of a supportive wife sitting at a table beneath the chandeliers. I watched the room carefully as Charles Whitmore finished explaining the clause that had been buried quietly inside the original agreement for more than 2 decades. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. The laughter from earlier in the evening had disappeared completely. In its place was something far more serious. Curiosity. Respect. And for some people, a quiet calculation. Investors do not simply listen to stories. They measure what those stories mean for power and control. Richard stood a few feet away from Charles on the stage, and for the first time in the 43 years I had known him, I saw uncertainty settle into his posture. He was still standing straight, still holding himself like a confident executive, but the energy had changed. The man who had joked into the microphone minutes earlier now looked like someone reconsidering every word he had said. Charles Whitmore did not rush the moment. He understood the value of silence better than anyone in the room. Silence allows truth to settle. Eventually he stepped slightly away from the podium and looked across the audience again. I believe that answers the question of why Eleanor's role in this company has always been more than ceremonial, he said calmly. A few people nodded quietly. Others remained still, processing the information. At our table I noticed one of the younger investors leaning toward his colleague and whispering something about governance structures. The language of business had replaced the language of entertainment. Richard cleared his throat softly and stepped toward the microphone again. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled but noticeably tighter than before. Well, he said with a thin smile, I suppose tonight has turned into quite a history lesson. A few polite laughs appeared in the room, but they sounded careful, almost cautious. Richard continued speaking, trying to restore the lighter tone of the evening. But let us remember that the company standing today is the result of many years of leadership and strategic direction. He gestured toward the audience with a practiced confidence. Growth like this does not happen by accident. He paused briefly as if expecting applause. None came. The audience listened politely, but the dynamic had shifted. The narrative was no longer simple. Charles Whitmore watched Richard quietly for a moment before speaking again. That is certainly true, he said. Growth requires leadership. Then he added something that changed the room once more. But leadership is strongest when it is built on accurate recognition of the people who made the foundation possible. The sentence was delivered gently, without accusation. Yet its meaning was unmistakable. Richard did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once and stepped back from the microphone. I realized then that the conversation had moved beyond his control. For decades Richard had been the voice of the company. Tonight someone else was telling its story. I remained seated, feeling a calm that surprised me. I was not angry. I was not embarrassed. Instead I felt something closer to clarity. For years I had allowed Richard to shape the public version of our life together because correcting it always seemed unnecessary. The business succeeded. Our employees built stable careers. The company provided opportunities for hundreds of families. That seemed more important than recognition. But sitting there in the quiet ballroom, I realized that something deeper had changed over time. Richard no longer saw our partnership the way he once had. At some point the story of our shared work had slowly transformed into a story where he stood alone. Charles Whitmore stepped away from the podium then, signaling that the formal interruption had ended. The host of the evening approached carefully, uncertain whether to resume the schedule immediately or allow the room a few minutes to absorb what had just happened. Meanwhile Richard descended the steps of the stage and began walking across the ballroom toward our table. His pace was measured, but I could sense the tension beneath the controlled movement. Conversations resumed quietly around the room as people watched him approach. When he reached the table he did not sit down immediately. Instead he stood beside my chair and leaned slightly closer so that only I could hear him. We should talk about this later, he said in a low voice. The words were calm, but the tone carried a hint of frustration. I looked up at him for a moment. His expression was not angry. It was something more complicated. Concern. Calculation. Perhaps even a trace of disbelief that the evening had unfolded this way. I nodded gently. Of course, I replied. My voice was steady, almost peaceful. Richard studied my face as if searching for a reaction he expected but could not find. After a moment he straightened and took the empty chair beside me. Across the ballroom, Charles Whitmore was now speaking quietly with several members of the foundation board. He did not look in our direction again. His role in the evening seemed complete. Yet the consequences of what he had said continued to ripple through the room. I noticed two executives from one of the shipping companies that partnered with Hayes Logistics discussing something quietly near the bar. A group of younger investors were scrolling through their phones, likely searching for old records about the company's founding structure. Information moves quickly in rooms filled with people who know how to interpret it. Richard reached for his water glass and took a slow sip before placing it back on the table. "This will create unnecessary speculation," he said quietly. I looked toward the stage for a moment before answering. "Speculation only exists when people do not understand the truth," I said. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the glass in front of him as if studying the reflection of the chandeliers in the water. For the first time that evening, neither of us spoke. Around us, the gala slowly returned to motion. Waiters resumed moving between tables. The host thanked guests for their patience and announced the next segment of the evening. But the atmosphere had changed permanently. A story that had been simple for 25 years was no longer simple. And as I sat quietly beside the man I had spent most of my life supporting, I realized something with complete certainty. The comment he had made on stage had not simply embarrassed me. It had revealed a truth that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface of our lives for decades. A truth that no longer belonged to whispers in private rooms. Tonight it had been spoken out loud. I sat beside Richard as the evening slowly returned to its scheduled rhythm, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom was no longer the same. Conversations had resumed, glasses were lifted again, and the quiet music behind the velvet curtain returned, yet something invisible had shifted among the people seated at the round tables. The story of the Hayes Company had changed in the space of a few minutes, and everyone in that room understood it. I could feel it in the way people glanced toward our table, not with curiosity anymore, but with careful attention. Richard kept his posture composed, though I noticed the way his fingers rested against the stem of his glass without lifting it again. He had always been good at maintaining control in public, but this was unfamiliar territory even for him. Across the ballroom, Charles Whitmore spoke with a small group of foundation board members. They stood in a calm circle near the edge of the stage, discussing something quietly while the host of the evening introduced the next portion of the charity program. Charles did not look toward our table again, but his earlier words continued to echo through the room. The truth, once spoken clearly, has a way of staying present even after the conversation moves on. A few minutes later, one of the event coordinators began describing the projects that the Whitmore Foundation supported. Large screens near the stage displayed images of community centers, education programs, and medical research facilities. Normally, Richard enjoyed this part of the evening because it placed donors like him in a position of admiration. Tonight he listened politely, but his attention was elsewhere. After a while he leaned slightly toward me again. "We should leave soon," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but the suggestion sounded more like a decision than a question. I looked toward the stage for a moment before answering. "If you prefer," I said. "The program will continue for another hour." Richard exhaled slowly and nodded. For several minutes neither of us spoke again. The speakers on stage continued presenting their reports, and the audience responded with polite applause at the appropriate moments. Yet I noticed something interesting happening around the room. Several people who had worked with the Hayes Company over the years were now approaching Charles Whitmore one by one during the short pauses between presentations. They greeted him respectfully, speaking in low voices. Occasionally they glanced in our direction before returning to their conversations. Investors are rarely interested in drama, but they are always interested in understanding where authority truly exists. Richard noticed it as well. His gaze followed those small interactions carefully, measuring them the way he measured market trends or contract negotiations. Eventually he turned toward me again. "You never mentioned that Charles structured the investment that way," he said. The statement was quiet, almost thoughtful. I met his eyes for a moment. "You were present when the agreement was signed," I replied gently. Richard looked away toward the stage. "I remember the investment," he said slowly. "I did not think that clause mattered anymore. The honesty in his voice surprised me. For years Richard had behaved as if the early details of the company's structure were simply stepping stones toward the larger organization he eventually controlled. Tonight he was realizing that some of those early details had never disappeared. They had simply remained quiet in the background. I folded my hands together on the table and spoke calmly. "It mattered to Charles," I said. Richard nodded once but did not respond immediately. For the first time in many years I sensed that he was reconsidering something deeper than a legal clause. He was reconsidering the story he had told himself about the company and about our marriage. Around us the ballroom continued to glow beneath the soft chandelier light. The large windows reflected the skyline of Manhattan, and the gentle murmur of conversation blended with the music playing behind the stage. Yet beneath that elegant setting the evening had become something entirely different from what it had been when we first arrived. Eventually the host of the event announced a short intermission before the final presentation. Guests began standing from their tables and walking toward the bar or the terrace overlooking the city. Richard remained seated for a moment longer before finally pushing his chair back. "Let us get some air," he said. I stood with him, smoothing the fabric of my dress as we stepped away from the table. The terrace doors opened onto a quiet balcony where the sounds of the ballroom softened behind thick glass panels. The night air was cool and carried the distant hum of traffic far below. Richard walked to the railing and looked out across the city lights without speaking. I joined him a few steps away. For a long moment we simply stood there watching the skyline stretch toward the dark horizon. Finally he spoke again. "When I made that joke earlier," he said slowly, "I did not think it would turn into something like this." I considered the words carefully. "Jokes often reveal what people believe is harmless," I replied. Richard gave a faint, thoughtful nod. The reflection of the city lights moved across the glass behind us as guests stepped onto the terrace in small groups. Some recognized Richard and greeted him politely before continuing their conversations further down the balcony. None of them mentioned the speech. But the respectful tone in their voices carried a different weight now. Richard turned slightly toward me again. "Charles has always respected you," he said. I smiled faintly. "He respected the work," I answered. For another quiet moment neither of us spoke. The city continued glowing beneath the night sky, and the soft music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the glass doors behind us. Then Richard said something that surprised me more than anything else that evening. "I think tonight reminded people of things I stopped thinking about a long time ago." I looked toward the skyline again, considering the thought. "Sometimes foundations only become visible when someone points to them," I said. Richard did not argue with that. Instead he stood beside me quietly, watching the city lights the way a man watches something familiar with new understanding. And in that calm moment on the terrace I realized that the evening was no longer about embarrassment or public correction. It had become something much more important. It had become the beginning of a conversation about truth, partnership, and the quiet structures that hold a life together long after the applause fades.